Well, there have been bombshell developments in Canberra today at the Senate inquiry into Australia Post and the removal of the talented CEO Christine Holgate. The inquiry was established after Labor supported One Nation's bid for the Senate to scrutinise the circumstances leading up to Christine Holgate's departure on November 2 last year over her decision to reward 4 employees with Cartier watches worth $20,000. Now, this all happened back in 2018. Last week, Christine Holgate accused the Australia Post chair, Lucio de Bartolomeo, of treating her, quote, like a criminal and throwing her, quote, under the bus during a period she now regards as, quote, the most harrowing 10 days of my career. Christine Holgate provided these Cartier watches in recognition of the fact that 4 executives had delivered $66 million of new business in 2018. Yet in 2020, the Minister responsible for Australia Post, Paul Fletcher, said, we need to take care of taxpayers' money. That was from a government that had run up $1 trillion of debt, a government that forked out $30 million of our money for a lump of land at Badgerys Creek valued at $3.06 million, a government that gave a female artist $20,000 for her yawning room at a Woolloomooloo gallery, $20,000, the price of 4 watches, to an art group, Vital Statistics, for Project Immaculate, where a Melbourne artist is filming and recording, quote, monthly live self-insemination to elevate the experience of queer reproduction and disrupt heteronormative parenting narratives. They got $20,000. Christine Holgate's administration had brought in $66 million, and when this happened, the $20,000 for the watches, she'd only been there for less than a year. She was very talented. At the end of February this year, Australia Post announced a 6-month profit increase of 100%. She was the CEO for 4 of the 6 months up to December. Why the hell did the Prime Minister buy into this last year? He demanded Christine Holgate stand aside while an inquiry was conducted into the watches affair, and if she didn't stand aside, he said she could go. Now, we've just been through weeks of all this business about women needing to be heard and have the same say as men, and outrage at the bullying of women. So where does this fit in? Anyway, the inquiry into the watches took place, apparently at a cost of $350,000, 17 times the cost of the watches. And the law firm Maddox found, quote, there was no indication of dishonesty, fraud, corruption or intentional misuse of Australia Post funds by any individual involved, unquote. No wonder the report wasn't released and only saw the light of day on the Friday before the Australia Day weekend. The purchase of the watches had been approved by the responsible Australia Post executive, including the then chairman John Stanhope, and at no stage was there any objection raised by anyone. But the Prime Minister in the Parliament, on hearing of the $20,000, said, I was appalled. It's a disgrace. It's not on. So appalled and shocked was I by the behaviour of a chief executive. Well, today at this inquiry, Christine Holgate has blamed the Prime Minister for driving her out of her job, saying he humiliated her in the Parliament and triggered a process that led her to being unlawfully stood aside. Just listen here to Christine Holgate.
Yet I lost my job, a job that I loved, because I was humiliated by our Prime Minister for committing no offence and then bullied by my chairman, Lucio de Bartolomeo. Unlawfully stood me down in the public direction of the Prime Minister. This made my leadership at Australia Post untenable and seriously threatened my health. I have done no wrong, for their bullying of me was far from over. I was subjected to a biased investigation and intimidated with constant threats of further allegations and criticism.
Well, Christine Holgate also said to the Senate inquiry that all of this had caused her health to deteriorate, quote, to the point where I could not find my voice to fight back. I've asked Peter Credlin to join me tonight because much of this is related to proper advice to the Prime Minister and an understanding of a simple act of Parliament. She joins me tonight. Peter, thank you for your time. Peter, just a couple of procedural points. It seems to me that the government doesn't stand its own statutes. Australia Post operates under its own Act of Parliament. There are 2 quote-unquote shareholding ministers, Communications and Finance, and only they can make directions to the board. So how did it reach this point?
Well, it's all very murky. I'll say a couple of things. I worked for one of those shareholder ministers, Richard Alston, and then later on was another shareholder minister's chief of staff in Helen Coonan. So I understand the Aussie Post's framework, if I can call it that, the governance framework pretty well. And my parents once had an LPO, a licensed post office. So I understand some of the issues out there on the ground about the long-term sustainability of the business, which go to the heart of where she was, Christine Holgate, in terms of the turnaround project. You are absolutely right. There's a thing called a legal direction. It can be given to Australia Post. It's quite an involved process to give a direction. And in the evidence today, there were some pointed questions asked of the chairman, Lucia Bartolomeo, and he was asked pointedly, you know, in removing and getting her to stand aside, Christina Holgate, were you doing that at the direction of your shareholder ministers? He said no, he was not, but they had obviously consulted amongst themselves. If they have to give a direction, it's a very different process than what looks like went through here. And you know, am I really honest in the politics of the watches? Cartier watches was ripe for a tabloid newspaper front page. I think if she had her time again, $3,000 cash bonuses would have been better. Perhaps even another branded watch or, you know, something else. But was she in breach of any requirements, any fiduciary, any governance requirements as CEO? No. In fact, she had an authority to spend up to $150,000 without the remit of the board. So she was absolutely inside her rights. And I don't know Christina Holgate at all, but I do know Marcus Blackmore well. He regards her highly. I looked very closely for many years at her performance at Blackmore's, the vitamins company. She was pretty outstanding. And when she came to Australia Post, I was impressed at how quickly she got her head around the logistics business, because Post has got a parcel arm and a letter arm. And the parcels make money, the letters don't. And that's how it washes its face. Around the world, they've divested the parcel business in many equivalents of Australia Post, and they're in a lot of trouble because we email now, and very few of us send a letter through the post, and the business letters are not there. And so this is where I think her dismissal had as much to do with her opposition to privatising some elements of the business as reportedly was in the Boston Consulting report as it was anything else.
Can I just go back, though, to the statute? I mean, the Prime Minister, given that he made that statement in the Parliament, under the Act can't make directions. Now, it's quite clear that neither Fletcher nor Cormann, who was then the Finance Minister, made any directions under the Act. And as you know, under the Act, before any direction, they have to, quote-unquote, consult with the board, not with the chairman, but with the board. Now, there was no such consultation. They made no such direction. So any request to suspend Christine Holgate was not only inappropriate but completely invalid. Now, I understand the Australia Post submission to this inquiry refers to, quote, the direction by the Minister for Communications to the Chair of Australia Post on October 22, 2020, that the CEO of Australia Post, Christine Holgate, be stood down. Now, there is no evidence, Peter, of any of this, of such a direction. And again, under the Act, before such a direction can be made, the Minister has to consult with the board. Now, that plainly didn't happen.
Yeah, but I think what you're focusing on quite appropriately is the letter of the law. And what I got the sense of today in the testimony from the chair is he mightn't have got a formal direction by virtue of the statute from the government in relation to Holgate. But once the Prime Minister had gone into question time and said basically she will stand aside or she will go, well, that was the direction. And then there were a series of phone conversations between some on the board, the chairman and Holgate in this sort of this triangle that basically, and she says she was bullied and her hand was forced.
I mean, why? I mean, if you and I, we have an ego trip here, but if you or I were advising the Prime Minister, we would have made sure that he knew what his powers were under the Act, and we wouldn't have allowed our leader to make that kind of outburst in the Parliament. What on earth could have provoked him to say that? I mean, you'll stand aside or you'll go while I have an inquiry. He didn't have those powers.
No, he didn't have the powers, but I also think he let the issue get to him.
Yeah.
And he thought, as some do, standing tough in the parliament was the way to go. I guess the difficulty is a lot of people don't understand that the legal status of Australia Post, it's a GBE, a government business enterprise. It is there to make money for the shareholder, which is the Australian taxpayer. The money that she spent was not taxpayer funds per se, it was business revenue inside the company.
Yeah.
And you're right to say that these staff members had just earned this massive contract to keep banking inside these Australia Post outlets, which in country towns, a lot of the places you and I go to, Alan, you can't bank anywhere but Australia Post. So if it had been lost and that contract had not been renewed, would be in all sorts of trouble.
That's it.
I think the problem with the PM sometimes is he reacts to the issue of the day, but not strategically looking at how it might play out over a week or 2 weeks. He also didn't pull up Anthony Albanese because Anthony Albanese, well, does he listen to them? I don't know.
I don't know. But see, just coming back to this point, if we talk about a direction, now under the Act, any direction from the Minister to Australia Post has to be put before both Houses of Parliament within 15 sitting days. That didn't happen. I mean, it seems to me these people didn't know the detail of the Act.
But that's because I would assume when you're talking there about the 15 sitting day rule, it's because it would be a disallowable instrument and laying it before, in this case, more likely the Senate. It gives the crossbench and the Labor Party the option of trying to disallow the direction. Now, you can have a direction by the letter of the law, as I said, or you can have a direction which is a couple of heated phone calls from the Prime Minister's office to somebody and you can get the same outcome. One is legal and one puts you, I think, in a very, very difficult sentence. Not just, court of public opinion, but as Holgate said today, there's breaches of her contract. There's likely breaches of the Fair Work Act. Where's this going to end up? I mean, Matt Canavan said on my show tonight that Bartolomeo needs to go.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. See, Peter, you and I are talking about strategy. You try to win an election. This is the last thing you need with a very, very successful woman. And she still really has not finished with Australia Post. She refused to sign the deed of release because the deed of release would have required her to say nothing for 12 months and work for no one else for 12 months, while the executive of Australia Post could go out and say whatever they liked about her. So technically, she hasn't left Australia Post, yet on the eve of this inquiry, they've appointed her replacement. I mean, what do you think the political fallout of this is?
So just on that point, they appointed someone to replace her yesterday, but it's not clear that she's actually legally left her job. I think that is a huge issue that will still pay out. And I think that, if she stood her ground, there'd be certainly not just compensation, but a legal claim for restitution, i.e. put her back in her job. And then all hell would be to pay. Look, I don't know how much her gender had to do with her treatment. I think the way it's played out in the media has something to do with that, because she certainly held to a standard that dear old Dr. Lamming in Queensland isn't. She's been pilloried over $3,000 watches, and he's going to leave in disgrace and get $100,000 from the taxpayer as a sort of farewell payment. But I think the bigger issue, and it goes back to that Boston Consulting report, I know for a fact there are some inside the coalition that would love to break up Australia Post. They'd love to sell the lucrative parcel business called Star Trek. It's been something I have been in rooms when it has been discussed. I've always been violently opposed. Tony Abbott was violently opposed because it's the one protection regional Australians have. It's why you can get a letter posted from Melbourne. It can go to Darwin and it costs the same single flat rate as the letter from one suburb in Sydney to the next suburb in Sydney. It's equalising the cost for all Australians so that there's equity in the system. Now, the fact that she was opposed to any moves to dilute that ownership structure of Aussie Post, she didn't buy the Boston Consulting report, was that partly why people were happy to remove her? Or was it because of what the PM said in question time? Because it's not on her performance, Alan. It's not on her performance. On all measures, she's a pretty exceptional CEO, and her history coming in is pretty exceptional. So I think there's a lot more that will come out. And she put in a submission This is important. To this inquiry, she put in a 151-page submission.
Yep.
I've had a good look at it.
Yep.
It's one of the best submissions I've ever seen,
Absolutely.
very detailed. And importantly, when she was under the gun today, without almost a reference to a note, she could remember dates and times and emails and information in a way we never saw that from Daniel Andrews in the hotel quarantine inquiry, did we? I don't know. I can't remember. I'm not sure. We got that day in, day out in Victoria from ministers about something that had happened 3 or 4 months earlier. She was right across the detail today. She was an impressive and pretty compelling witness.
Absolutely. And of course, the inquiry found that there's no evidence of dishonesty of any kind as well. I mean, she said basically everything that has happened to her has no legal standing. I mean, at the end of the day, I just wonder, I'll come back to the last point, Peter, and I'll let you go, but in terms of political fallout, with everything else going on, this is the last thing the Morrison government needs, surely.
I think you're absolutely right. There's no doubt about that. I don't think it's going to go. I don't think it's an issue that the opposition can campaign on, though, because they were as much gunning for her in October over these watches.
Yes.
As they are now trying to say that they weren't. I don't think that's the issue, but I think how it retails out in the public domain is damaging. And of course, she's got a lot of support from the LPOs. The LPOs are about 70% of all the post offices that you and I would ever walk into. The ones in metro areas are predominantly owned by Australia Post, the corporation. All the other ones outside of the metro areas are mum and dads like my mum and dad, who bought it as a business, who ran it as a business. They are in her corner. And I tell you, when you go to post your letter, and someone will say, what do you make of the Christine Holgate story? They're going to be her advocates. I think that's where it's going to be damaging for the government, and this is not going to go away quickly.
No, and Di Bartolomeo should be gone yesterday. At no point was he prepared to stand up to the government and defend Christine Holgate.
She's smarter than the whole board put together. She is smarter and has more business acumen than the whole board put together.
No doubt about that. They've bitten off more than they can chew here. Great to talk to you. Thank you for your time, Peter.